Welcome everybody, and all panelists, please do switch on your videos and feel free to regulate your audios as and when you need to. And as I was saying just now in our brief interlude, the first session I know many of you were here for, so you already will have your own impressions of what's happened, but just to kick things off a bit, and for Stephen's benefit, who was not here, and Raquel also, we've had what I think has been an extremely rich discussion. I only wish that we could have allowed it to go on for much longer, because we had some quite clearly different views expressed. And while we're talking about the possibility of achieving international cooperation, it's really worth bottoming out whether we can even get two academics to agree on some of these issues. So I think that there were 2 points that remained with me from the earlier discussion, which I hope we can pick up and build upon in our session. The first is we're meant to be talking about implementing AI governance from a geopolitical angle. And in order to enforce governance arrangements of any kind, as Milton Müller pointed out, we must have a point of leverage. We must have some real way to exercise power over players who may not comply with the rules. And what is that in AI? There was a suggestion that it could be chips, but then again, there was an emphasis on AI as part of an overall digital ecosystem rather than a phenomenon in its own right. And in principle, there may be other parts of that digital ecosystem which could lead to some form of leverage, and maybe we need several points of leverage. The other point was, as I said, we're meant to be talking about taking this forward into implementation, but there is an open question as to whether implementation is actually possible in any global sense. Do we just have to settle for having different regional and national regimes in parallel with one another? But there was a very interesting suggestion that maybe stakeholder alliances could be the way forward, a way forward. And I think some of you may have something to say about that from the industry angle. So as I've already signaled to you, what I'm going to do is, rather than try to introduce you myself, I will let you all introduce yourselves individually. I would say now, for the benefit of the audience, that I think we have an excellent coverage in this panel, both geographically, because we have speakers from the UK, the EU, United States, but also from different intellectual and practical backgrounds. We have business, both large and small, represented, and academics, of course, as ever. And I hope that between you, you will fill the gaps in one another's perspectives. So do please feel free in your initial remarks to comment on what has gone before, to say more about your own background so far as they're relevant to today's discussion, and to try to address any of the questions that have been circulated in advance as far as they appeal to you. So I will shut up and hand over to our first panel speaker, who is Dr. Stephen Pattison from ARM. Stephen, over to you.
Claire, thank you very much. I'm going to spend a lot of time telling people who I am, but I will make one point, which is I was at ARM until last month, and as of now, I'm no longer with ARM, and I'm about to pop up in another role, but I can't yet announce it publicly. But I think my knowledge of ARM is still fresh enough for me to be able to draw on it for the purposes of this discussion. But the other point about my background, which I was going to pick up, is that before I got into tech policy, I used to work on foreign policy. I was a member of the British Diplomatic Service. And one of the things I worked on there was arms control. And one of the parallels that keeps popping up when we talk about, let's call it AI governance, again, it's not a very clearly defined term, but I think we kind of know what it means. At least we know enough for present purposes. When people talk about AI governance, sooner or later, they usually talk about the way in which the international community, the world, has tried and managed to control the spread of some serious destructive weapons, particularly nuclear, chemical, and biological. And I personally don't think any of those models are directly applicable to what we might try to do here. But that doesn't mean there may not be some lessons in each of them for angles that we can think about as we try to approach some kind of international standardized AI governance arrangements, if you like. I'll start with a very pessimistic point, which is that the sad truth is that the international community didn't agree on any of those arms control regimes until after there had been a terrible episode involving one of the weapons. So it was essentially chemical weapons. The attempt to control chemical weapons started in the 1890s, but it was essentially after the First World War and the use of mustard gas and so on that really got underway. But it wasn't until much later that a proper regime was created. Nuclear weapons, of course, the control regime was not put in place until after nuclear weapons had been used. Biological still requires or is still looking for a control regime as such. There is a treaty. And although biological weapons have been less often used, there are some instances of them having been used which have tried to impel the process forward, but so far not enough. So lesson one might be a very pessimistic one, which is, unfortunately, the world doesn't get its act together to control these things until after a disaster. And that would be terrible. And so I think for us, the lesson has to be, we can't wait for a disaster. We need to make progress now. The second point about this, I'm going to pick up the question you pulled out of the first session, points of leverage. And it's a very interesting question, because if you look at the nuclear weapons regime, it's what it controls is actually access to nuclear weapons technology. And in order to make a nuclear weapon, you need plutonium or highly enriched uranium. And the way in which that the regime is constructed is that actually the vast majority of countries in the world can only get access to nuclear technology for peaceful purposes if they agree not to use it for military or weapons purposes. And you can see in that a kind of model that might be applied. It may not even be a model that's based around countries playing the major part, but it may be, I think, as you suggested, Claire, around different stakeholders. So you can imagine a model that goes, look, AI is going to be a collaborative effort. No one company is going to be able to produce all the technology that is necessary to create a decent supply chain for AI technology. So there's going to have to be collaboration, interoperability, interaction, and so on. You can imagine a situation where actually, as your ticket for participating in that knowledge sharing activity, you, company or country or both, have to have declared that you will abide by some basic ground rules. Now, quite what those ground rules are, we can debate, but you can see that the structure of a regime on that basis might not be impossible. And I think, and this will be my final point to start with, I tend to be, I'll be honest, usually on the optimistic side. And I took great heart from the AI Safety Summit that was held in London at the beginning of November, where essentially what that is looking at are the really big AI risks, the so-called existential risks, the risk of AI being used to design super weapons of one sort or another, or operate super weapons of one sort or another, or situation where human beings lose control of AI and it runs amok, it goes wild and does things which we don't want it to do. And that summit brought together a number of countries, a number of companies, a number of other stakeholders. It has set up a process of beginning to create AI safety institutes in various countries that will all provide, if you like, single point of contact for discussion and negotiation and elaboration of principles. And, blah, we can go on. But I think that is an important first step. And, right now, I think, we in industry and stakeholders should get behind that and try and make that work. And the model at the end of the day might be the model I've described, which is unless you ascribe certain principles, you don't get to share in the knowledge. I think that's it for my opening remarks, Claire, if that's all right.
That's great. Thank you so much, Stephen, and thank you for giving us some grounds for hope after your initial pessimism. So let's move on now to Kayla.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for organizing this panel. It's a great event so far, so looking forward to the discussion. My name is Kayla Blomquist. I am co-founder and director of the Oxford China Policy Lab, and I'm currently pursuing my PhD or DPhil at the Oxford Internet Institute. My topic there is looking at state and regime legitimacy seeking through AI governance strategies. And as was touched on in the previous panel, I think quite importantly, is AI can mean many things, and there are a lot of underlying infrastructural aspects to it as well that people might not think of. And so acknowledging that a lot of countries use AI as kind of a marketing tool. So studying that as one of the layers and what can we learn about state desires, motivations, and future behaviors in all of these different layers that fall under the umbrella of AI by looking through that lens. Within that, I have quite a strong focus on the PRC, as well as it in context with the US, UK, and EU. Previously, before coming to Oxford, I worked as a US diplomat in China in the years leading up to and during COVID. I focused quite heavily on technology transfer and export control topics. I no longer represent the US government, so all of my views are now my own. And then I made my way to Oxford to really try and continue bridging the gap between people's understanding of how Chinese foreign policy works, as well as these emerging technologies and all of the intersectional policy questions and risks that stem from there. So now with the Oxford China Policy Lab, among many other topics, looking quite closely at the risks that are posed intersectionally between US-China relations and geopolitical competition and AI, especially when it comes to prospects for international governance that might be heavily needed, but unfortunately not incredibly likely given the relationship. So kind of a mix of previous panelists, I'm a bit on the pessimistic side for both the direction of the bilateral relationship between the US and China, as well as prospects for really meaningful regulation. But I don't think we should stop and sit in that pessimism. We should really try and find corners of this and angles of this where we can have quite meaningful progress at the very least and push forward nonetheless. So with that, looking forward to hopefully a productive discussion. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Kayla, and for being brief also, but I do hope we can come back to any ideas you may have of little corners that might be worth exploring, that might lead to something positive. So for now, Maxime, on to you.
Thank you very much, Claire. So yes, my name is Maxime Ricard. I'm Allied for Startups Policy Manager. So just perhaps a couple of words about Allied for Startups itself, my organization. Allied for Startups is a non-profit association that is the policy voice of startups and scale-ups in the EU and worldwide. We are member-based, we are member-led, and we have more than 14 members, which are national startup associations. So we are an umbrella organization, an association of associations, if you prefer. And yes, I think I will be providing a different angle, perhaps, definitely a more EU policy and startup angle to this discussion, because what we do at Live for Startups is advocacy work, mainly in Brussels, at least as far as I'm concerned. And doing advocacy, what we focus on are key policy files and topics that are relevant to the startup ecosystem, including artificial intelligence, data, cybersecurity, you name it, everything that can be relevant basically to startups and scale-ups. I personally work mainly on artificial intelligence and tech regulation in the European Union, which is why I'm based here in Brussels. Now, as you can imagine, artificial intelligence itself is fundamental for the startup ecosystem. Growth, competitiveness, job creation, all of that is driven by startups in the EU. Startups are actually responsible for the majority of innovation, growth, and job creation in the EU. I think it was in 2020, if I'm not mistaken, there were around 20,000 startups in the EU. So when startups innovate in the AI space, they have a huge impact. They contribute even more than established players, hence the importance of having a thriving startup ecosystem. However, in the EU, what we have seen is that AI regulation has been developed with the biggest players in mind, rather than trying to focus on the smaller ones. And even before the creation of ChatGPT, I'm sure that you have heard about ChatGPT, obviously, EU policymakers had started discussing how to regulate AI and so on. And in April 2021, the European Commission proposed the Artificial Intelligence Act, the AI Act, which has been mentioned in the previous discussion, which would be, when enacted, and if enacted, because it's still not the end, the first ever AI law in the world. And it would impose strict obligations on high-risk AI systems and ban unacceptable AI practices as well. So although this could seem like a good idea, and I think the AI Act might be a good idea in specific, if you consider specific provisions, we see it as something that could be detrimental for the startup ecosystem, which I'm representing, mainly for two reasons. Obviously, I will make sure to say more in the discussion, but just to give you an idea of what these two reasons are, the first one is that startups specifically are facing what we like to call a tsunami of EU tech regulations that have been created for the past year. We talked about the Digital Services Act, the DSA, the Digital Markets Act, the DMA, the Data Act, the Data Governance Act, there's the Cyber Resilience Act, the revision of the Product Liability Directive, all of that. Some of these files have been mentioned also in the previous discussion, but all of the files I just mentioned right now have been discussed, and some of them have been agreed by EU institutions in the past 5 years. So you can only imagine how burdensome all of these very technical regulations can be, particularly for smaller players like EU startups. So that's the first problem that we see. And the second one, the second main one, is the fact that this AI Act focuses almost exclusively on the risks. And instead of putting forward the opportunities that AI can bring to citizens, to businesses, to society in general, actually, the European Union opted for an AI governance framework that focuses on the risks that AI systems may pose rather than on the opportunities. So that's, of course, a big problem for very innovative businesses like us, like the startup ecosystem. I would just like to conclude my opening remarks by saying that a narrative saying that countries the majority of countries prioritize competitiveness over safety about AI system. I don't think it does really apply, at least to the EU. Actually, one may even agree that it's because of the geopolitical tensions around artificial intelligence that the EU wants to be the first region to regulate AI, hoping the AI Act will be replicated in other parts of the world, like the GDPR, for instance, that we all know. However, if we talk about how geopolitics hinder the implementation of AI regulations, then I can say that indeed, if countries or regions implement different AI regulations, this is a problem for startups. Startups want to be global and scalable from day one, and if they don't like fragmented frameworks, obviously, the more harmonization, the better. So I'll just stop there for now, obviously. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Maxime, for outlining both the importance of startups and the possible impact of them on them of too much regulation. I think it's not only small businesses that would put forward this kind of argument, and it's, of course, that there are attempts to draw lines below which smaller companies are not going to be affected. But it's pretty hard to know where to draw those lines. So we might come back to that issue. But right now, let's move on to Wendell. And Wendell, could you introduce yourself? You have such a long and varied CV that I really wouldn't know where to start in picking out which are your most important and relevant activities. So I'll leave that challenge to you.
Thank you very much. I don't know either, but my primary focus these days is within the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs, where I founded and co-direct with Anya Kasperson the AI and Equality Initiative. For the past more than 20 years, I have been a gadfly in the ethics and governance of emerging technologies, trying to raise questions even before they come on the radar for other academics, and certainly long before they come onto the radar for our political leaders. And I'm best known for a book called Moral Machines: Teaching Robots Right from Wrong, but more recently I authored a book called A Dangerous Master: How to Keep Technology from Slipping Beyond Our Control. And that's just about to be republished as a paperback in the next month or so. But in all of my comments here, I want to focus on the prospects for creating global infrastructure for AI governance. That's been a concern of mine for many years. I think we learned through the Committee on Certain Conventional Weapons, the difficulty of even just educating policymakers about the challenges posed by lethal autonomous weapon systems, let alone how we are going to move forward and act upon that. So in that regard, I tried to organize an international congress for the governance of AI, which was to be in Prague in 2020, but it was scheduled for May in Prague in 2020. So we all know what happened there. And that conference largely became a smaller online event. But what concerns me is there's a lot of flag waving about how we need international governance, not a great deal of clarity where we are going to focus on getting international governance, and even less clarity on what form, what global infrastructure we might put in place for AI governance. So in that regard, Anya Kasperson and I organized a series of workshops at UNESCO and at the ITU this spring and early summer, focusing specifically on that question. For example, there had been a lot of hand waving that perhaps CERN or the IAEA might be a model for international governance, but there had actually been no real in-depth discussion about what we can learn from CERN or the IAEA. So we had representatives from those two bodies as part of our workshops to tell us what they thought the lessons were and for us to probe how we could go beyond that. The product of these 3 workshops was a framework for the international governance of AI, which the UN's ITU, International Telecommunications Union, had asked for. And that proposed 5 symbiotic components, the 2 most important being a neutral technical organization charged with continuously assessing which legal frameworks, best practice, and the standards are achieving the highest level of acceptable globalization. Oh, excuse me, not that one. I jumped to the wrong point. A normative governance capability with limited enforcement powers. So the limited enforcement powers is essential, but very difficult in the international sphere. The larger countries in particular are loath to give international authority to any body that would have the ability to hold governments accountable for their actions. And this is the problematic that we have right now, in that the Secretary General has empowered a higher level advisory panel to advise on AI governance. But the question is whether they can advise anything that will get through the General Assembly next fall that would give anyone enforcement authority. And one of the reasons we focused, for example, our workshops on UNESCO and the ITU, but we also had representatives from the Human Rights Committee, was that those are the 3 bodies that, if given some enforcement authority from the General Assembly, are most likely to take it up and try and put in place some infrastructure within the UN system. But which would be the most desirable path forward because of the legitimacy that the UN system brings. But if we can't get something within the UN system, then perhaps we can begin to create something outside of the UN system and hopefully get it subsumed within the UN umbrella over time. Now, within our framework for the international governance of AI, the other most critical element was an AI global observatory, building on ideas from Sir Jeff Mulgren and a committee that he put together. And that would fulfill a lot of what are often referred to as soft law functions. There's a lot we can do within soft law. Soft law, for those of you who don't know the term, refers to standards, laboratory practices and procedures, insurance policies, a whole flock of mechanisms. And a lot can get done with soft law, and oftentimes soft law becomes the precursor to hard law. But the EU in particular hates soft law, even though they utilize it themselves in many regards, and even though institutions around the world like the IEEE and ISO are putting in standards which in effect are soft law, but the EU hates it because there's no enforcement authority. But I would say no enforcement authority, there may be no enforcement authority, but sometimes actually there is light enforcement authority that comes with soft law. For example, you can be, you might not be able to publish a paper if you don't follow the ethical guidelines that a journal has prescribed. Another way forward, I think, for us is to put together stakeholder alliances. When people think of stakeholder alliances, the first thing they think about is corporations. And the corporations have, at least the AI oligopoly, the corporate had talked about corporate self-governance, but that's failed abysmally. And furthermore, the corporations would like to push policies that will maintain the oligopoly. So, for example, they want corporate control of foundational models. They don't want open source. And where there's good arguments for corporate control and against open source kills all the small players. So we have the AI oligopoly going 100 years forward. The other stakeholder group I'd like to mention is the public. And I think the public is actually hardly ever really discussed in international governance, but there are areas where we could put in place new governance mechanisms. For example, scams, just controlling scams. And we actually talked about this at the International Consumers International Congress, but it also came up as a proposal out of the Vatican very soon afterwards. But we need coordination, enhanced safety and standards, and we need to defuse militarization. And my final point, and pardon me if I'm taking a little bit too long, of course, is the US and China. We are ratcheting up and moving toward the Thucydides trap, but there are some signs that we might be able to back off on this. It'll be hard to do so before the US election and before we see what the results of that are. But we also might hope that something comes from Xi Jinping that indicates he's not interested in global competition. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Wendell. You've given us a few things to think about there. And rather than react myself, at this point, I'm going to invite Raquel, who has joined us at very short notice, to pick up the role of essentially a discussant or rapporteur and give us your view, Raquel, on the picture that is emerging here and your own views and any gaps you think you can plug.
Yes, well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. It is always good to share this panel with colleagues that I already know and new colleagues that I didn't, but it's a pleasure anyway. So I think that what the rest of colleagues have said is very accurate and very opportune, because it gives you the flavor of which is the overall feeling about the international governance of AI, which is a mix of pessimism and a mix of positivist realism. I mean, most of the people that are working on the international governance of AI feel that still the multilateral fora that do exist cannot cope with the whole reality of AI. But that doesn't mean that it is not the role. Actually, it's still a growing topic. And for that, as for example, Dr. Stephen Pattison said, it happened with arms control. At the very beginning, countries didn't want to partner with each other. Then the next step was to agree on common baselines, always based on national law, as it is happening now. For example, with some documents that derive from some international coalitions, such as the G7, G20. But overall, my thought in this specific case is that it is very early to talk about international consensus, because first of all, you need to have your own house cleaned, first of all. So if you have your house cleaned first, you will have the international regime to some extent built up once most countries have their own thinking inside their own territories. Why? Because, for example, as it usually happens in most activities, the international governance of AI is usually covered or addressed by countries such as the US, countries from the European continent, so EU member states, UK, but also Norway, and also a few other countries such as China, India, but very specific countries. But the main situation is that countries from Latin America and the Caribbean, countries from the African continent do not usually submit proposals, do not usually submit inputs, and also they are not usually invited to some boards and advisory boards. For example, if we look at the UN High-Level Advisory Board on AI that was launched at the end of 2023, a few months ago, we see that from Latin America and the Caribbean, there are only 4 or 5 people. And from the African continent, there are some people, but people that do live in the United States and do work in US corporations, which makes completely sense, because at the very end, these are the companies, these are the stakeholders developing the AI systems. But still, I feel that we miss a big bunch of the whole reality of how to govern AI. That will be in terms of how to build the structure and who to engage to govern AI internationally speaking. And then in terms of the topics, I feel that there is still room for improvement when it comes down to priority setting. Because, for example, when we look at the G7 declaration, the G20 declaration from New Delhi in India, the Global Partnership on AI and other initiatives, even the UK AI Safety Summit. Each coalition is ad hoc grouping of countries, not to talk about private sector, NGOs, civil society organizations, the media. Each of them frames its own priorities. So there is still no commonality across most of the topics that are considered as important, except for privacy indeed, and except for safety and security. Apart from that, still there are some topics that are not usually covered by most of the international settings that are addressing AI. For example, we have the case of how to guarantee that some languages will not be lost in the way of developing AI, because, for example, languages is from smaller countries, from vulnerable communities. And this also has an effect even in the startups, for example, because if startups want to have a great market share of their services and products, still the AI systems that are being developed by all types of companies need to address all these realities. So overall, this will be my main thoughts in terms of the governance system. Still no priority setting commonalities and a large amount of initiatives that are not still leading to a common place where to discuss this. And for me, the last point, actually, the last question will be, actually, do we want now to have an international organization that handles with AI, or rather, do we prefer to have different dispersed settings where each stakeholder can raise their voice? Because if we channel the governance of AI through one single organization, it can speed up the process, but it can miss some voices. And I am not talking only about specific stakeholders, but also about specific countries, and even about specific groups that do not represent any stakeholder as such. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you, Raquel. You've done a fantastic job in a very short time of wrapping up many things that have been said. And just picking up on this point of should we be aiming for one international governance infrastructure, or should we have several? I think it's self-evident that one is more ambitious than several, because we do have various things already going. And arguably, and you weren't here, but Dr. Gry Hasselbalch did put this forward earlier, there are considerable advantages to having the parallel channels going. So what I'd like to do now is give each of you the opportunity to make further comments based on what you've heard so far, including, of course, Raquel's remarks. And if it's okay, Maxime, I'd like to start with you, because it does seem that the EU is an advanced one of these possible parallel channels, and we've had it mentioned, of course, by both Raquel and earlier on by Gry, who both are working within the EU framework. And pointing to the relative absence in all these discussions of countries of the global south. They have in other contexts, and my own background, incidentally, has been in telecoms regulation, and we certainly saw it there, that countries of the global south, very many of them did adopt the EU framework of telecoms regulation. So it may be that countries will look to the EU, those that don't already have something going on the AI governance front will look to the EU as a starting point for what they would like to do. So I wonder, if you were asked to advise some of these countries on how suitable or otherwise the EU framework is, what would you say to them? Sounds as if you'd like it to be easier on small business, but do you have any other ideas?
Sure, absolutely. Well, I think if I had to advise any other country or region regarding EU law and specifically AI regulation, and even more specifically the AI Act, I would tell them to be extremely careful with it. What is vital for smaller players like startups is to be able to comply with the laws. And when we talk about compliance, we also talk about compliance costs. Ideally, startups should only focus on innovating and maintaining their competitive edge in the AI landscape. Now, with the EU's proposed governance framework, this has shaken the industry, the AI industry, and AI startups as well. Startups are players that do not have the necessary resources to comply with overly complex and burdensome regulations. And hiring, for instance, a dedicated expert to be able to comply with an overly complicated law, like it was the case for the GDPR, is just not doable for players like startups. Think of it this way: many AI startups, many startups in general, are created by one person in a garage. So I know this sounds a bit cliche, but sometimes it's actually the case. When we started monitoring the situation on the AI Act, our members were so concerned about it that they asked us to organize comprehensive online briefings on the AI Act specifically. And the first questions that they asked us, the first question that they asked was the following: is the AI Act going to be like the GDPR? Are we going to go through a GDPR 2.0 situation? They were so concerned about the AI Act being too difficult to comply with that this is the first question that popped up. They were so traumatized in a way by the GDPR that they wanted to know whether it was going to be the same thing or not. So I would definitely tell those countries and regions that want to implement something like the AI Act to take it easy with the smaller players. And if I had also to continue my explanation, I would like also to follow up on what has been said regarding soft law. I think international alignment via code of conduct, global initiatives like the ones that have been mentioned, for instance, and soft law is key for the industry in general and for startups specifically, because it provides a framework, clarity, while allowing for innovation, right? So with codes of conduct, countries can agree on a specific set of voluntary commitments, and it is also the case with, for instance, the European Union's AI Code of Conduct, which was announced in May 2023 by Executive Vice President Margaret Vestager, which is specifically focusing on generative AI, hoping that other countries, like I think Asian countries mainly, would eventually join the process. I would definitely say that to that country or region, be careful with the compliance cost and make sure to go for soft law.
Thanks very much, Maxime. Anybody like to go next, or shall I just choose somebody? Kayla, I see a big smile. Does that mean you're ready?
Sure, happy to. And really fascinating take. Thank you so much. My thoughts are in a slightly different direction, going back to Raquel's final question in terms of what is an international governance structure going to look like? Is it even possible or desirable to aim for one very comprehensive and fully inclusive version, or is it going to be a bit more piecemeal? And my take on that, both from an inclusion standpoint in terms of what countries or actors are involved, as well as from what is accomplished, what rules are set, and what is managed. I would predict it will be piecemeal no matter what we set our sights on, simply because, yes, it is incredibly ambitious. It's very difficult to get all countries moving in the same direction on any issue, especially one as complex. as this. It's many sets of issues at once, and especially given quite specific technological competition questions, especially related to the US and China. So from that, we're very likely to see kind of like-minded, as the US and kind of other Five Eyes types countries tend to say, like-minded kind of coalitions in different forms, as well as we've seen China initiate and announce its own global governance initiative around AI. The details of that are very much yet to be seen, but within and in addition to that, we have seen efforts by China to kind of rally other countries throughout the Belt and Road Initiative and throughout the Global South, as well as through the BRICS Forum to try and create blocks of action within there. So I would say kind of no matter what we are aiming for, this kind of separate groupings of stakeholder alliances is most likely. And as I think previous panelists might have pointed to, perhaps this constellation would be preferable based on some other measures. Perhaps it will be quite inefficient, especially for perhaps industry to navigate. So lots of trade-offs within that. But in terms of the content of the regulations and what these different governing bodies will tackle and try to regulate specifically, I think I would predict that to also be very piecemeal. These are very tricky things to figure out what to do, what government should do about, algorithmic recommendation systems, for one example, or facial recognition, not to mention military applications and many, many other directions of this. There's a lot to figure out. No one fully knows what they're doing. And so we're seeing at the national level a bit of experimentation. And I would, back to the kind of chips export controls discussion, I would say among many other factors, one of the reasons this has been so prominent in the kind of policy initiatives that we've seen globally around AI governance is that export control systems, that is an existing set of policy mechanisms and tools that existed for other types of technology, and it's one that governments have an understanding of how to deploy, whereas other types of governing tools and mechanisms, both domestically and across borders, will have to be developed, and that takes time and sometimes seeing the negative impacts before you know exactly what to do. A final point, it will be likely quite piecemeal necessarily in terms of process of these regulations. So I think this happens to some extent in the EU, but I focused a bit more on Chinese AI policy. And as one example, the algorithmic recommendation regulation set out a registry for algorithms where at the first step, companies just needed to register what algorithms they were deploying, the purpose, what it went into them at a very high level, but then it will be built upon kind of as a tool to see into what exists and then what needs to be regulated. And while tools, policy and regulatory tools like that can be used to different ends in different types of governance systems, there are valid concerns around that being used to more authoritarian ends. Any government deploying any form of regulation will need to have visibility into really what is out there before they know exactly how to handle it.
Great, thank you so much, Kayla. So Stephen, Wendell, either of you like to come back next? Yes, Stephen.
And I'm happy to, and I'm keen to. A couple of points on the issues that have been raised. One on the question of whether we can aspire to one overarching governance agreement or several. I think it has to be several, and I think it's important actually as we think about the way forward that we try to divide the problem into different bits, because confusion's the wrong word, but as I see it, there are basically three essential AI risks. One is what I call the existential risk, which is, if we lose control of an AI machine, it does something we really don't want. If it designs weapons we don't want. That's one. The second is what I call the civilian application risks, which are the things that most of the regimes and most of the proposals currently talk about. They're talking about the use of facial recognition, they're talking about privacy, they're talking about accountability, they're talking about algorithmic transparency and so on. All of that, I think, falls into the sort of civilian applications that, how do we develop trust in AI to be using it in our daily lives, to enable us to use it comfortably, confidently in our daily lives? And the third big bucket, of course, is the military application of AI. Now, I think in all of these areas, the political and to some extent the technical dynamics are actually quite different. And I think they need to be handled in a different way. And my second broad point is that, well, the second broad point is a bit about China, I suppose. So I think we need to have a regime which, certainly when it comes to the existential bucket, China is in the tent. And this was kind of always the case if you look at the nuclear weapons controls. The nuclear weapons states were the US and originally the Soviet Union and China and France and the UK. And these were states that didn't always see eye to eye on a whole host of things. But they came together on the existential threat posed by nuclear weapons, I suppose. And I think you can probably bring China and others into the tent on the existential threat. And that also has implications for how the regime is negotiated. And I thought Wendell had some very interesting points, but I'm also a bit skeptical about dumping all of this on the UN. I mean, I spent years working on UN issues, and I'm a great supporter of the UN. But the UN is one of those things, if I may say so, that works better in theory than in practice. And one of the troubles with these kinds of negotiations at the UN is that they get embroiled in sort of political negotiations. Some countries think this is all a plot to stop them getting access to artificial intelligence at all, and that they'll throw spanners in the works. Some countries think that this is a good opportunity to, let's face it, spike the US's ambitions to become an AI superpower because they hate the US, because they hate the US support for Israel, or all kinds of extraneous things come into it. And I think, and it sounds like a silly thing to say, but actually I think some of this is too important to give it to the UN, where it might get broiled in committees for goodness knows how long. So I think, for example, if you take the existential bit, you could bring together China and a clutch of other countries, and with luck, they could come up with some sort of agreement. And then, of course, the effort would be for all of them to try to sell it to the rest of the world. And it might need a bit of changes as you go through the rest of the world. There'll need to be all sorts of promises on technology transfer to the rest of the world and so on and so forth. But that, I think, would be my view on the best way ahead. The other thing, when you get to civilian applications, now civilian applications is quite different because you've only got to talk about the word privacy or security, and let's be honest, they don't mean quite the same in Brussels as they do in Beijing, those things. And we could spend the rest of our lives trying to bridge that gap and not really getting very far. But I think we can take comfort from the fact that quite a lot of the many regimes that have been, principles that have been proposed, and there's now loads of them, companies have got them, countries have got them, international organizations have got them, so on. Actually, there is a common, and they nearly all focus on civilian applications. There is a common core, a common ground of things which people now think, these are the kinds of things that should constitute the building blocks of a trustworthy approach to the civilian application of artificial intelligence. And that's the kind of thing where, let's face it, if China didn't want to join, or not just China, if it didn't want to join it, doesn't join it. But the rest of the world does join it. But it may not be a reason, I'm chancing my arm here a bit, it may not be a reason for denying, let's say, a country that doesn't join technology. They just don't use it in the same way as everybody else, and we now all know that. Whereas the existential one, if a country said, no, I'm interested in an AI that can actually take over the world because it could do a better job than you lot have done all this time, that may be a reason for denying them the technology. And then you get into the military application. The military application, well, we know that there's already been discussions on lethal autonomous weapons, and they are proceeding. If the word proceeding isn't an exaggeration, they are at a snail's pace. They are going very, very slowly, and they will need to be built up very slowly, I think, through the traditional arms control methods of confidence building methods and, you know, joint exercises and so on and so forth. So I think those are my thoughts on what I've heard so far and what I think is the way ahead. I'm not desperately, but I'm trying to distill some optimism and a sense of future direction that we could reasonably aspire to out of all of this. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Stephen. And I'm sure that one or other of this group is going to come back to you on the ways and means of getting at least the first of these three initiatives you're describing, initiatives in three areas, underway. But let's move on to Wendell, last out of this particular round, but far from the least, because you've been trying to do it, Wendell. And how do the remarks up until now, and in particular what Stephen's just been saying, resonate with you?
Yes, I mean, this whole discussion resonates with me, and I'm very appreciative of Raquel in bringing up this issue of whether we're talking about a centralized body or distributed governance. Kayla made it clear that we're talking about distributive governance, and Maxime made it clear that a lot of that's going to be soft law, which I agree with. I will be a little bit of a contrarian here because I think it's got to be a hybrid model. It's going to be distributed whether we like it or not. It already is distributed, and AI is not contained within any realm. It is touching every area of modern life. So the concerns of the IEEE and ISO, for example, are very different in the standards that they look at than the standards that the WHO looks at for AI. And the proposals that UNESCO has with its concerns, particularly around the global south and their ability to enter into the AI world are again very different again. So we're going to have distributed governance, and the distribution may in the end turn out to be hundreds of different stakeholder groups. I think we have no idea what those will be. But I actually think, even if it's largely as a soft law function, that there is need for an observatory that convenes coordination discussions, that helps us understand the state of AI and flags the issues that have to be addressed in the coming years. So I think we need both coordination on an international level. Now, how might that come about? It may first come about with individual initiatives, thinking about the military, thinking about and the militarization, thinking about economic issues, thinking about consumers, and that they are individual initiatives, but they come within the umbrella of at least discussions on an international level, because most of these issues are not isolated from each other. Militarization can happen because you have a totally new breakthrough that nobody else has been thinking about. So that's my basic thought there. On the question of China, China has to be at the table. And I think the wooing of China is central here. So that's my preliminary thoughts.
Thank you. And yes, I think we all agree on the importance of China. And Raquel, may I come back to you at this point, because we've had a full round of the initial group of speakers responding to each other and to your summary. Are there other points that you'd like to bring in now?
Yes, maybe the fact that sometimes when we are talking about how to govern AI, we also need to address how other technologies are being governed as well, and also considering that growingly countries and also the European Union as a supranational organization are proposing these initiatives on economic security strategies. Now it looks like economic security is something new, but actually it's a sort of umbrella where all things that were managed or governed dispersely have been picked up under the same umbrella. So now with economic security strategies from the US, from the UK, with a different wording, and also from the European Union, also from China, we see that AI is being one of the most important target technologies, because first, in terms of industrial policies, there are some countries that are concerned about lagging behind in the development of AI, and the fact that companies from their countries will need to buy AI systems from third countries that represent, according to their national views, a threat to national security, a challenge to their economic growth and sustainability. So this was something that I wanted to raise, because sometimes we tend to differentiate between the governance of technologies in terms of regulations, impact on human rights, which is highly important, but we also distinguish it from other issues such as economic security, and now all these topics are converging actually.
Absolutely, yes. And I see what you've been saying as complementary to one of the major themes of the previous panel, where Milton Muller introduced the thought, and I don't think anybody disagreed with him, that AI is not a topic that you can tackle on its own as a technology, because it's part of a digital ecosystem, and any governance of AI has to be accompanied by governance of other parts of the digital ecosystem. And now, Raquel, you're expanding that to say that we're not just talking about a digital ecosystem, we are talking about our economies and, of course, also our cultural systems and so on, that we can't do any one part of this in isolation from the other parts, which we need to recognize, but recognizing these things doesn't actually make them any easier. Though one point which I've picked up from elsewhere, and Kayla, I'd like to bring you back in on this, is given that we're all saying that China is a really important part of this picture, we've got to have them round the table in the tent. But they're not there to the extent that we would wish. And we all know that there are important geopolitical reasons for this. But you've also drawn attention to the fact that some Western nations just are not equipped really to have a dialogue with China. They don't have the expertise in Chinese language or culture, which would be needed to have genuine in-depth discussions with people from China. And if we're talking about stakeholder alliances, we certainly would want to have Chinese stakeholders in there, Chinese small business associations, Chinese consumer associations, to take a favorite of my own. So would you argue that expanding the West's expertise in understanding and communicating with China could be a step in the right direction? And if so, how would you go about making it happen?
Thank you so much for this question. And I feel quite lucky to then make a plug for having started the Oxford China Policy Lab. This gap in capabilities was really like a core founding theme in terms of being very concerned about general lack of understanding and understanding China's motivations, how it goes about policy, how to engage with China, and also understanding some very real and tangible immediate national security threats that its approaches sometimes pose to Western nations, bringing more education around all of those aspects to countries like the UK, throughout Europe and the US. And I think that's absolutely fundamental to building in resilience towards into not just the US-China relationship, but the broader West-China relations ecosystem. And it becomes even more acute when you also have a bit of a capabilities gap inside of government around what is AI and its many layers, and also in terms of how do you achieve consensus about what are the risks that AI poses when so many people in government have very little technical understanding around this. To pivot slightly to focus on the US-China dimension, I think it's a bit of its own animal, where there are very real, deeply rooted tensions between the two countries. And a lot of them do come down to questions of technology transfer, intellectual property rights, and military risks that they pose to each other. For example, in my previous life, in the US mission to China, working on this quite directly, there are very real actions that the Chinese military and central government take to acquire sensitive US technological research, especially in areas related to AI. And so some very specific pain points within the US government, they're preventing some of the more productive discussions that otherwise are quite needed. And then kind of on the Chinese side, this concern that's quite long-standing, even pre-AI discussions or advanced technology, of the US attempting to keep it out of the international system, prevent its rise, and not wanting to handle that form of competition. And so you have these very deep-seated divides that make some of these international fora less likely. I was very encouraged by the recent UK AI Safety Summit, and hopefully that is a small stepping stone to build off of. And back to, just to wrap up, Dr. Pattison's point about, especially on the existential threats level, having China included is absolutely critical. And so I have spent a lot of time thinking, okay, despite or acknowledging these real tensions that are quite meaningful, and we're not going to get past some of the existing layers, can we separate out, potentially global threats posed by foundation models that are especially advanced or specific military applications of AI? Can we separate this out from this competitive dimension, a dynamic, so that it is not calling the rest of the world into jeopardy? So I'll wrap up there.
Thank you. And Wendell, you have a raised hand. Please come in.
Yes, definitely on the China front. There's a real interest in China to open up conversations with the West, in particular the United States. The conversations were relatively robust about 6-7 years ago, and particularly in the the energizing of the AI ethics regime and the building of an AI ethics community within China. China does have regular conferences on international governance, including one that was at Hong Kong University of Science and Technology just a few weeks ago, and co-chaired by Tsinghua University. And there they all expressed an interest. The difficulty with China always is when you have interest in AI safety and AI and governance, are you talking to the more idealistic academics? Or are you talking to the more real political individuals? And I think there is a little bit of overlap at all of these conferences. So even what you hear from the academics, that the government is not inured to that. There is also a report that just came out that I'd like to direct all of your attention to from Concordia, which is a bunch of young China scholars, many of whom have relationships in the West also, on AI safety in China and what the research is. And I think it's an interesting report, and I think it does make Westerners at least understand that what's going on there is much more robust than we know. But I think the serious question is that there's been a collapse of the communication road, starting with the Trump administration and the ratcheting up of tension between China and the US, and then going through the COVID years. So there has not been adequate Western representation, even at these efforts by the China international policy community to reach out. And I think we need to focus seriously on that. But China has to come forward a little bit too. We need a much clearer understanding from Xi Jinping and his government what his intentions are. And perhaps he just wants to ratchet up. Perhaps the hegemony of the hegemonious competition between the US, China is very real for him, and that it's looked at as a winner take all. But I think in the previous panel, Milton Mueller underlined that US policy is largely protectionistic and is fearful of China. And China is largely protectionistic, and the US is largely driven by fear of China. And you can see that if those are the two policy sides confronting each other, then the ratcheting up is inevitable. So we need some creative policy genius. And as I say, I think Xi Jinping has an opportunity here if he wants to break through what is an inevitability of that tension getting worse.
So do you think, if I could come back straight away to you, Wendell, that AI could actually be that opportunity to bring together China and the US, at least in Stephen's category 1 of the existential threats?
I do think so. If the existential threats are real enough in the minds of the policy planners to understand that we have to avoid that at all costs. And that's this very difficult problem of how real are the existential threats? Which are the existential threats? In other words, is it just this notion of artificial superintelligence, and is the creation of super bombs or the fear of just autonomous weapon systems able to drive warfare beyond human control? Which of those is going to get embedded in the mind? I think the latter is a clear problem. I think there are all kinds of unperceivable ways in which AI could exacerbate tensions. But I think if that's there, it is possible that we could have learned, we haven't demonstrated it yet, but we could have learned from the Cold War that mutual destruction doesn't work. And we need to find a way to diffuse it. And we need to understand that we're dealing with a technology that is beyond predictability. These are complex adaptive systems. They act in probabilistic ways. They are embedded in complex social systems. They are not predictable. And therefore, we need to be very serious about AI safety and communicating on AI safety and sharing what we learn on safety to ensure that that tragedy we all fear will not happen. If we don't, the tragedy is what's going to determine international governance. And then we're just at the mercy of what's the size of that tragedy.
Well, let's not speak yet about tragedy, but let's go back to Stephen, because you set out the tripartite possible framework. And also, we've been speaking about stakeholder alliances, although mainly about international organizations of one kind and another. But I wondered, Stephen, if we could backtrack a bit to your idea earlier on about supply chain alliances, which could, in principle, become an instrument for getting countries or certainly companies to comply with whatever governance may be in place. Can you see these being formed right across the entire necessary supply chain for modern AI systems? How many companies would you need to involve, for example, to get a complete supply chain?
Well, very big questions, Claire. I mean, I think the short answer is, well, having said the short answer is, I think I'm about to embark on quite a long answer, actually. But
okay, well, we have 5 minutes.
So even that may be the short answer. So I think I take the point, which I think Wendell made earlier, that self-regulation has at best a sort of mixed history, right? But if you were looking at ways in which, and it was your starting point that prompted the thought, if you're looking at the ways in which leverage could be exerted against entities, companies or countries who we thought we were not behaving properly, part of that leverage would be to say, you are going to be excluded from the global supply chain that's going to be driving innovation in artificial intelligence. Now, I say global supply chain, and it is right now a global supply chain, but the global supply chain already has a massive spanner in the works, which is Washington's sanctions on tech transfer to China, which there are various people have touched on them. And I will just make a footnote actually to that, which it seems to me that the recent US focus on China technology actually started from a piece of work commissioned at the very end of the Obama administration from the US semiconductor sector, where a lot of US semiconductor companies basically said, China's stealing a march on us. They will soon have technology which is better than ours and so on and so forth, and we can't let this happen. Now, that's where I think some of it started, and it started in that sense with Obama's concern about whether the US was falling behind in the technological race. So one of the problems which is, I think, bedeviled outsiders' attitude to US sanctions on China has been this slight whiff of protectionism in the US, right? A sort of sense of we must draw up a very high fence, not around our security concerns as much as around our industrial policy concerns. And that suspicion hasn't helped. So when you say, do I think there's a chance of a global supply chain being pulled together? I think that's going to be very difficult given the current US-China relationship, because the whole point about the supply chain is the leverage one. And the deal is basically, you don't get access to the latest research and innovation unless you play by these rules. And right now, the US position is to China, you don't get access to the latest research and innovation, full stop. And actually, I just saw today, reported in the US press, that there is a letter from the US Congress to the administration saying that the US administration needs to think about tightening sanctions on legacy technology, i.e. not just cutting-edge technology, which the US has sanctioned hitherto, but on the import from China into the US of much more standard chips and so on. And then you look at it the other way around, also today in the press, hardly a day goes by without there being relevant stuff in the press, NVIDIA, which designed chips which it thought it could supply, well, it could supply to China and not fall foul of US regulation. The word in China is that they actually don't need those chips, thanks very much, because they're already beginning to make them themselves. So the global supply chain has this great big fly in the ointment, which is the US-China tech relationship. So and as you perhaps would have inferred from my earlier remarks, I think it would be very unfortunate if we designed a system where China felt on the outside of it. Now, okay, yes, if you're talking about what I call the civilian applications, and if China wants a different interpretation of privacy and security, it can stand outside that. That's not going to mean the end of the world. It just means they do things differently in China. But if you design something which is talking about as a passport to accessing innovation in technology, you need to play by these rules or you're not getting it. I think as if we were to design such a system, knowing that it would deliberately exclude China, we may be undermining its effectiveness right from the start, because the Chinese, they have very, very good engineers. They have great expertise. They've got great history. I mean, in the last 10 years, I've seen it. 10 years ago, Chinese engineers, put it bluntly, were coming much more to ARM for advice. Now they're not. They're doing it themselves, and they're actually giving ARM and other companies advice, put it that way. So China is really cracking ahead with technological innovation. But that said, if we could at least get some companies to agree that actually, in order to take part and enjoy the benefits of innovative research, you would have to agree to abide by certain principles. That then, maybe it has a snowball effect. That whole idea of whatever reform you're trying to introduce, you can sort of introduce it by getting coalition of the willing together to start with, and it's like picking up a few flakes of snow on the ground and rolling them into a ball in your hand, and you put it on the ground and you push it along, and it collects more and more and more. Now, it never collects everyone. There will always be some outliers. There's always going to be some crank somewhere who doesn't want to play part of this snowball game. But at least you've identified them, and you've made clear they are outliers, and you've made clear they are literally beyond the pale. So I think it might be worth trying. I think it's relatively straightforward because you'd get quite a lot of like-minded companies, and certainly in the West, you'd get companies who were keen to advertise the trustworthiness of their products by joining such a scheme. So I think that's to its advantage. So I think it is one of the things which we should certainly explore.
Well, that's great, Stephen. And I think you've brought us just to where we need to be wrapping up. So I'd like to say that I, for one, find this idea of yours very much worth further inquiry and exploration. And I do wonder if your next professional step that is still shrouded from us might enable you to do something about it. Sounds as if it would be great if you could. But I think I just have to say that I thank you all for a very fruitful set of ideas. And they may not go anywhere on a global level, but they certainly will go into the report that we're going to produce on this event. And let's hope the report gets around, and maybe we will get some more feedback and some more snowballing around some positive initiatives. So, Robin, I haven't left you time to say anything much, but that's all from me.
Well, I want to thank you all. I don't really think there's much time to do a robust summary of all the rich discussion that we've had. I think a couple of takeaways, just very quickly, a quote, first from Wendell. A is a technology beyond prediction. In other words, there are existential issues that we need to deal with. And then, Stephen, I think we need a coalition of the willing. And I think if we take into consideration all of the huge number of parameters which are circulating around in this complex area, I think what seems clear is that something will be done by some actors. There will be some winners, there will be some losers. And what we have to hope for is that on balance, as we go forward, we don't need to have to wait for a crisis, such as we had with innovations in nuclear technology or chemical and biological weapons, before we get some governance arrangements in place, whether nationally, regionally, or internationally, which have some teeth and accountability in them and are inclusive of both the global South and the rich North. Thank you all for your really rich insights. And I look forward to reading the report that will come out of it. And I'm sure you do too, and your comments on it. Thank you so much.